So now I want to talk about partisan bias in the media. And when I talk about partisan bias, I'm talking about the idea that people have that the media, the news media, tends to favor... I'm sorry.
Easy, bud.
Tends to favor one party over the other. Right? There are people who argue that the media has a liberal bias, meaning that it tends to favor the Democrats. There are people who argue that the media has a conservative bias. That means it tends to favor the Republicans. And I want to talk to you about some of the evidence that people use to sort of prove their argument or try to prove their argument. A very common one that people turn to is talking about the people who make the news. They talk about the people who make the news, and one of the things that they talk about is they talk about the fact that journalists, and I'm talking about national journalists, so journalists not at the local level, but national journalists who work for the big papers, journalists tend to be Democratic. And not just kind of, overwhelmingly. There was a study that was done in 1992 of journalists, and they asked them who they voted for, President Clinton or President Bush Sr. In that election, President Clinton, I think, got 43% of the vote. Bush got 37%, and Perot got the rest. 88% of journalists voted for Clinton. 12% supported President Bush. 88%. Overwhelmingly Democratic. National journalists are overwhelmingly Democratic. Publishers and the CEOs of the media corporations that own these companies, because most of the media outlets, almost all the media outlets that we see are owned by 6 major corporations. The CEOs and the publishers of these corporations tend to be Republican. And so there are people who say, see, this is why there's a conservative bias in the media. What are the odds that the people who own the companies are going to be having their outlets go ahead and do anything better than conservative news? Now, I'm just going to give you my opinion here. Whenever I'm talking fact, I'll tell you when I'm talking fact or when I think I'm talking fact. When I'm talking opinion, I'll tell you when I think I'm talking opinion. I think these two arguments are BS. As a matter of fact, I think people use these arguments when they don't have any evidence. So they rely on these arguments because they don't really have any evidence about bias. So I say, well, journalists are all Democrats. Oh yeah, but they're trained not to go ahead and let their views enter their work. Corporations are all owned by Republicans. Well, as I showed you here, I have a corporation that owns a liberal outlet and a conservative outlet, MSNBC and CNBC. They're all about making money. They don't give a damn whether or not. So I think people rely on this stuff because they don't have any evidence. Now, other people say you can go ahead and you can tell that there's bias if you look at the actual content of the news. If you look at the news itself, you can see the bias in the news, the way they report things, the things they say, the things they don't say. And there are two different kinds of analyses that I want to talk about briefly. Bullshit analyses and fair analyses. These bullshit analyses are done by these organizations that pretend like they're interested in finding out the truth. They're not. The Media Research Organization is a conservative organization. If you read their website, they'll tell you that their sole goal is to find evidence, is to find liberal bias in the media. They're in search of evidence of a liberal bias. The Media Research Center. That's all they're looking for. So if you work for the Media Research Center and you're looking for liberal bias, and let's assume, for the purposes of demonstration, that this is conservative bias. My laptop is liberal bias. This is what the people at the Media Research Center do. I found, oh shit. Everything's okay. They trip and fall. They go right past the conservative. They go right past the conservative bias, and they go, "Look, I found liberal bias."
I wish that was.
I found liberal bias over here. That would have been cool on that being filmed. They don't care about conservative bias. They're not looking for conservative bias. They're not looking for that at all. So they'll climb over this to get to the liberal bias. Media Matters is a different organization. They're a liberal organization. They're only interested in finding evidence of conservative bias. They're the same way, but I'll try not to trip over the podium in this case. This is liberal bias. That's conservative bias. This is what they do. Oh, excuse me. Okay, here we go. I found bias. They're never going to find this. They're not looking for it. So before they even start their research, they already know what they're going to find. The only thing they're looking for, liberal bias. Before they start their research, they know what they're looking for. That's all they're going to find. This is complete BS. The fair analyses are the ones that have been done by political scientists. And if you look at all the different studies that have been done by political scientists, there's no evidence of bias one way or another in favor of one party over the other. There's simply no evidence of that. But people talk about it all the time. And yet when you look at what researchers have done, PhDs, people in political science, people who do communication studies, when they go ahead and look for bias, they try and set up a very rigorous way of doing it. There's no evidence of a systematic bias in favor of one party or the other. Well, that's where some people, and myself included, have come up with an alternative explanation for why is it that people talk about bias, say there's a whole bunch of bias, and yet, at least when we've tried to find it in an unfair, in a fair kind of way, we're unable to find it. So I want to talk about two studies. One of them is called the hostile media phenomenon. The other one is an article that I did with a professor who's now at Harvard. The first one, the hostile media phenomenon. First, let me tell you what the definition of the hostile media phenomenon is. People tend to view balanced coverage as biased against their own point of view. People tend to view balanced news coverage as biased against their own point of view. If you're somebody who's very liberal, and you see balanced coverage that gives the liberal perspective and the conservative perspective, you're going to go ahead and say, that was totally biased in favor of the Republicans. If you're somebody who's very conservative, and you see balanced coverage that gives you the liberal side and the conservative side, equally balanced, you're going to say that was biased in favor of liberals. That's the hostile media phenomenon. And the first time it was shown was in the study that was actually done in 1985. And what they did is they got these two groups of people together, two groups of students. Some students who were totally pro-Israeli, in favor of the Israeli government, and students who were pro-Palestinian, in favor of the Palestinian state. For those of you who don't know, there has been a huge and long-standing clash between the Israelis and the Palestinians over the area in the Middle East. These people don't like one another, right? So they got these pro-Israeli students and these pro-Palestinian students, and they had them both view some news coverage of something that was called the Beirut massacre. This is back in the 1980s. The Israeli troops had moved into this camp, and a whole bunch of people wound up dying. It was a really awful, awful moment. And so they got these pro-Israeli students and these pro-Palestinian students, and they showed them news coverage of the Beirut massacre. The coverage was balanced. It showed the Israeli side. It showed the Palestinian side. It represented them both equally. And then afterwards, they asked these people what they thought of the coverage. As it turned out, the pro-Israeli students thought it was totally in favor of the Palestinians. The pro-Palestinian students thought it was totally in favor of the Israelis. They were watching the same thing, the same news, the same program, word for word, picture for picture, and they were seeing something completely different. So the researchers asked them, like, what was going on? What the hell's going on here? So they asked them a bunch of questions afterwards. And here's what they found out. First, both groups didn't think that the journalists were being fair, but for completely different reasons. The Israelis didn't think that they asked the Palestinians hard enough questions. Guess what the Palestinians were bothered by? That they didn't ask the Israelis hard enough questions. They thought they took it easy on them. Both sides thought that they were really tough on their side. The journalists were being really tough on their side and really easy on the other side. They also found out that, and this you guys know this both from the memory-based model and just from real life. Suppose you're sitting around the corner and you hear some people talking about you. They're talking about you for about 5 minutes. And they're mostly saying very positive things. But then they say 2 really shitty things. What do you remember?
The shitty things?
Yeah, remember the shitty things. Well, it turned out that all they remembered, mostly what was at the top of their head, were the negative things said about their side. So when they asked them questions about the report, it turned out that the only thing at the top of their head was all this negative stuff that was said about their group. And then the last thing they found out was that both sides believed that if somebody tuned in and they didn't have, and somebody to this news broadcast, and they didn't have any views one way or another about the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, that if a neutral viewer tuned in, they would wind up agreeing with the other side. The Israelis thought, if you go ahead and you show somebody this and they don't have strong views, they'll be totally pro-Palestinian by the time it's over. The Palestinians, of course, thought that if you showed it to somebody who didn't have strong views, they'd be totally pro-Israeli. What was causing people to see the coverage as biased? It wasn't the coverage. It was what they brought to the table. It was the filters that they were using to sort of interpret this news report. The bias they were seeing wasn't in the news. The bias they were seeing was their own.